everyone, it's Bria with Tails and Tanks. I am finishing up my 29-gallon tank today. I'll be prepping the plants, planting them, and filling the tank up. So thanks so much for watching. If you have any questions, leave them below. All right, bye. So this is the super glue I use in my tank. You can use it to apply plants directly to rocks and hardscape. I have some fishing line, in which case you can wrap plants around rocks and such. I'll be misting my plants as I'm planting them to keep them hydrated so they don't dry out. And then these are some plants for my trimming of my little 2-gallon tank here at work. I'll be putting in some flourish tabs. This is all of the plants we'll be doing today. And then my tank at home, I included some trimmings from last night as well. So I have plenty of plants. I'm curious to see whether it's enough. I know probably you can never have too many plants, so I am excited for this amount. I'll be rinsing them in this water to get all the stuff off of their roots before we start planting. And I'll be covering them in a wet paper towel until we're ready to start. So there is my setup, and I'm gonna get right to it. So thanks, guys. So these plants have a sponge over their roots. So I just took them off the sponge and I'll be keeping them wet. These are the plants that I'm going to have in my foreground. They are a type of crypt. So crypts, typically after you first plant them, there will be some plant melt. It's completely normal. So they have been starting to melt in my tank, but that's okay. They should come back as long as you properly plant them and have good nutritious soil. These are a really fun plant. They're called pink flamingo crypts. So just like the other ones, they have a sponge covering the roots that you need to carefully remove. You don't want to hurt those roots or else it might kill the plant. These plants are Bruce Green Broadleaf. I got a 3-pack. They have a pretty intricate root system. As you will see in this video, I struggled getting all the sponge out of the roots. They're a pretty hardy plant. I recommend Bruce's for any new tank goers, and they do not have to be in the substrate. Actually, it's best if you attach them to some hardscape, so rocks or wood, whatever you have in the tank. They will actually melt going into the substrate, so keep them above. Add those rocks to your tanks, and they are a hardy low light plant. plants are Anubias short and sharp. Anubias I absolutely love in my tanks. Just like the previous plants, they came with a sponge wrapped around those roots, so I am separating them. They're a hardy plant as well. A lot of Anubiases can be in low light, easy tanks for beginners. These ones are a little bit bigger than my nano types I have in my 2 gallon, but they look really good in the tank. Hardy plant, easy to care for. These are my Cryptocoryne package. My goal for these is put it in the background along the very back of the tank so they can grow up and kind of look like grass weeds underwater. Some of these were already experiencing some melt from transportation, so I'm not sure how many of these will survive in my tank. With crypts, they also have the sponge at the bottom. Crypts do not like to be moved around once planted in your tank. They don't like disturbances. I haven't dealt with crypts too much. This is my first tank where I have had so many of them, so we'll see how they work out. I did kind of rinse them in the water to kind of get that melt off of them that had in transportation. Do plant them in a very nutrient rich soil, so I'm excited to see how these will line the back of the tank. These are Ludwigia Ovalis. It's a 4-lead branch. These come with sponges over the roots as well, but there's a little metal casing keeping them on there. I kind of rinsed these in the water, and I don't think it was necessary. As you can see, a lot of the leaves came out, so you can probably skip that step. These you would just plant directly into the substrate, and they do need to be into the substrate. They're pretty heavy root feeders, and these are more of a mid-ground to background plant. I chose these ones because they do have a nice little reddish tone to them, which will really make the color pop in your tank. This plant is my Echinodorus rose. It is another stem plant. They are very heavy root feeders. These get quite large, so they're going to be one of my furthest background plants. I'm putting them in the two back corners of the tank. You can see I added another Echinodorus that's from my tank at home. It was an extra one that I had, so I decided to throw it into this tank. These are called baby tears. There's a really popular dwarf baby tears that people use as a foreground carpeting plant. This is a similar species. They look pretty similar except for a little bit larger. So I'm going to be using them as a mid-ground. You can see the cotton wrapping around the roots that I am removing with that little metal clasping. They also need to be buried directly into the substrate, at least all the roots. I'm very excited for this one. It is a Tiger Lotus Red. It did experience quite a bit of melt during transportation, so I'm not sure if it's going to survive in my tank, so we'll have to see. But if it does, it's a really, really pretty plant with big red leaves. I'll be using it as a mid-ground plant. Those roots should be buried directly into the substrate. These are my Anubias Nana that I have at in my previous tanks, including my 2-gallon at work and my 20-gallon long at home. They are a fantastic plant if you have a low-tech tank. That's something that does not have CO2 and might have low lighting. They thrive very well. I have an insane amount of growth in my other tanks, so I have trimmed them and I'm going to put them into the new tank and hopefully have the same success. These are also ones that stay above the substrate, so I will be attaching with my super glue to rocks and then placing them in the tank. Or I can also place them directly onto my hardscape rock wall in the front of my tank that you'll see soon. These are my Java Fern Thor's Hammer. I removed them from my tank at home. They just it didn't seem to really go in the tank, so I'm hoping to get good, that'll look good in this new tank. My tank at home does have quite a few snails in it, so I am just checking these really well to make sure I have no carry-on snails going into my new tank.
And otherwise, they are supposed to be above the substrate. So I'll be attaching them to rocks for this tank and placing them in. These are my root tablets. They will help my root feeders grow and kind of keep the soil very nutritious for the plants. I'm taking each tablet and I'm putting them in kind of a grid in the back, about 2 inches in between each tablet. So that should help in the long run of my tank. Now I'm going to start planting. One of the things I would do different is I would have added another bag of topsoil to this tank. So the crushed gravel in the bottom was really hard to get the roots down into the bottom of the tank. So I really needed some extra topsoil. Another thing I did is I did super glue some of those large rocks together so that they would hold tight with that super glue. So I started with the back. I put the Echinodorus right in the corners, and then I'll be planting the crypts along the very back wall. The crypts were kind of hard to get into the substrate, so I did struggle a little bit with that, but I eventually did get them all situated. I'm planting the Ludwigia Ovalis. Now that's going to be kind of a mid to background. It won't grow quite as tall as my Retrospiralis or my Echinodorus rose. And then towards the front of that, I'm placing my Java fern. That should be the next height. Hopefully it grows nice and tall. I'm spraying the plants down in between so they don't dry out. That's a very important step. Before I knew to do that, oftentimes I would have certain plants that the leaves would shrivel up and they never quite come back. This is my lotus. The root system was quite long in it, so I kind of rolled it up a little bit together to get it down in the soil a little bit better. Like I said, experienced quite a bit of melt during transportation. I probably should have reached out to the company, but we'll see what happens. It will be an experiment to see if they survive and if they come back. This is where I added my Anubias plants to some rocks. I found some rocks outside just in the gravel. I look for typically when I do that, quartzite is very common. Quartzite typically doesn't have any other minerals involved. You can see that's clear, kind of rinse it off beforehand. Make sure there's no secondary mineralization on the rock that might mess with your water parameters. Quartzite is pretty safe to grab if you want to add it to your plants. So here I am. I added all my Anubias. Next up is I'm adding those baby tears in the back there. And then once those are all planted, I'll be adding the pink flamingo as kind of a punch of color right in that center section. I also added some Bruce plant as kind of a mid to foreground in those line of plants as well. Next up, I'm adding the foreground crypts. I'm hoping they'll look like little patches of grass when they come in. Just a reminder, crypts do melt after you first plant them, but this is high quality tank sand, so it should do well in the front there. So, and now I get to start adding my Anubias nana and my Bruce plants to the very front with all of the rocks and kind of add more depth to my tank. Here I'm adding some glue to my Bruce plants to attach them right on some of those rocks. I really recommend having tweezers for this, and ideally you might want two tweezers because as you hold it down, it sometimes kind of sticks in the spot you don't want to, so it's really helpful to have those double tweezers to kind of go around. You'll see I later add that second tweezer. I first try to do it without it and it keeps sticking and I have to keep reapplying it. So, but it's going pretty well. You'll see I kind of go for like crevices and like focal areas in the tank. A lot of times when you're working with your tank, you want to follow the rule of thirds as much as possible. Now I'm filling up my tank. I'm using a watering can that kind of has more of a slower flow coming out the end of it. I also place it towards the side of the tank so I'm not disturbing the plants as much as possible. So I use the side of the tank, or I might put it on the rocks as well. You want to minimize the amount of disturbance with the sand in the front. You'll also notice that my water will turn a little cloudy. That is because I did not rinse my soils before I filled up the tank. It's a good idea to do that. I just never bother because I do a slow fill. The other thing I really recommend, which I haven't invested in yet, is a reverse pump. Instead of going back and forth with your buckets back to the tank, if you use a reverse pump, you can kind of just bring the water straight from the sink into your tank and control the flow of it a lot better. So look into that if you haven't already. I know it will make your water maintenance go a lot smoother. I just have not gotten around to getting one yet, so we're using a good old watering can. And this water is coming straight from my tap water. I always attempt to make sure it's about 80 degrees. I typically just feel it. I've gotten to the point where I can guess the temperature pretty well just by feel, and it's going directly into the And that is my setup for my new tank. So thanks for watching, everyone. I have added a list of all the plants that I used at the back of this video, so you can take a look if you want. It'll also be in the comments section. If you have any questions or concerns, let me know. Otherwise, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.